So it is my great pleasure to introduce Fabien Montcher. Fabien is assistant professor of history at St. Louis University. He works on the early modern social history of knowledge and politics with a special but not exclusive emphasis on Iberian worlds. His book entitled Mercenaries of Knowledge is just out by Cambridge. So something to look forward. And this year, Fabien is writing a new monograph on the political history of plants across early modern Iberian worlds, while in residence at the Newberry Library in Chicago. At the margins of projects dedicated to exploring the overlapping histories of bibliopolitics, biopolitics, rhizomes, and empires, Fabien co-directed last summer NEH Institute on Global Geographies of Knowledge, and he is the current director of the new Center for Iberian Studies at St. Louis University. His research has been sponsored by the UCLA, Clark Library, the Huntington Library, the ACLS, the NEH, the Spanish Ministry of Culture, the Flag Foundation of Lisbon, the Newberry Library, and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. Today, Fabien will be presenting Flights Out of a Global Mediterranean, an eco-critical reading of Bordel's Mediterranean. And let's welcome Fabien.
Okay, great. Can you hear me well? Okay, good morning, everybody. So my thanks today, this morning, are threefold. First, I would like to thank Tom for your generous invitation, as well as SEGS and T for the very efficient organization of this conference. I'm also very grateful for the intellectual rationale behind the organization of this panel that is showing us really the importance of historiography when thinking about what is the Mediterranean still today. And last, for giving me the opportunity to do one thing that I was not planning to do, which is a very close reading of Bordel La Méditerranée that I started this summer and that I have been immersed since the summer in it. So thank you, Tom, in particular, for granting me this opportunity to read this work again. So let's get started. So I will start with my original intention, and maybe should I say my original sin, because I wanted to offer you something, or to share with you some reflection on the political history of plants across the Mediterranean world and the Iberian world from the 1400s, 1600s. But while planning to do that, I started to check the index of La Méditerranée by Bordel, looking for plants. And what I realized is that plants are relatively absent from La Méditerranée. Or at least their presence is very discrete. And most of the allusion made to plants appear in the first part, not surprisingly. So where does this work today stand in relation with the study of pre-modern green imperialism? Well, it will be no surprise to all of you that Bordel saw the sea as an homogeneous organic ensemble. But it might be a bit more original to say and to insist that Bordel also saw the Mediterranean as a complex of seas. And I believe that he will not have disagreed that the unity of the sea resides in its fragmentation, what Orden and Purcell call the micro-ecologies of the Mediterranean in the early 2000s. So here the problem is not so much what is Bordel thinking about the unity of the Mediterranean or its fragmentation. It's much more about conceiving, theorizing this fragmentation, the shape of this fragmentation, and how does it unfold on a global scale. So there are two ways, I believe, to approach Bordel, and this is what the historiography since the 1940s has been doing. We can think of Bordel as this very traditional historian, right? Educated by historical geographer, Vidal de la Blache, who is opening his grand narrative using the environment as an excuse. But we can also think of La Méditerranée as this pioneering environmental history. I believe that these two approaches together tend to assume that Baudel's ideas of the global Mediterranean, chapter 3 of the first part, is based at the end of the day on the physical and human unity of the western part of the sea, chapter 4 and 5 of the first volume. So here we need to stop a little bit and think about how the use of archival, but also literary evidence in Baudel obscure the diversity of cultural practices and labor practices in the everyday material life of the sea. So if we look more broadly at the state of the Mediterranean study field today, what we see is that Baudel, no one will assume that Baudel used the environment as a backdrop, right? There's this very important article of Jason Moore who made this point a few years ago. However, the Mediterranean is still mainly approached through what Orden and Purcell define as the interactionist vision of the Mediterranean, a Mediterranean made of individualistic and communitarian assumption, where intermediaries, trans-imperial agents are the ones who are allowed to cross frontiers, to move from one ecology to another. So is there an alternative to that? I've been myself the one sinning in relation with that, working on intermediaries for a long time. So my point here is that we need to bring back together the ecologies with their micro-narratives that are severed by the environmental lines that Baudel is drawing in the Mediterranean and that we are still very much relying on today. So my question for you today is, sorry, I can't read. So. Would an eco-critical approach of the sea as an a-centered and non-linear ensemble, a rhizome in some ways, help bring these narratives and ecologies together? Well, why eco-criticism? Because I believe eco-criticism allows us to stress the point of intersection, friction, I would say, between literature and nature in the Mediterranean. What we see when we read Baudel through this lens is that both medieval and early modern literary sources caused Baudel to limit the reach of these famous temporalities to spaces and forms of labor associated exclusively with the people who literally occupy the Mediterranean and that he called the people of the sea. So how beyond the entanglements of the longue, the moyenne, and the courte durée, which are the most famous temporality in Baudel, can we think about a fourth temporality that would be best defined as the épique durée in Baudel from the point of view of eco-criticism? And what is this épique durée all about? Well, it's a temporality within which the historian lives in the here and now. His subjects inhabit the there and then, and the other exists in a time not contemporary with her own. And Baudel's temporality, the three famous ones, the longue, the moyenne, and the courte, delineate first and foremost a world of movement, what he calls l'espace mouvement, which is occupied by the people of the sea, les peuples de la mer. And altogether, they form this very restrictive definition of what Baudel calls in the first part, le milieu, which is very more restrictive than the definition, for example, of Lucien Febvre when he was speaking about le milieu in terms of dynamics, interaction between a multitude of beings. So the épique durée does for us creates a narrative space for Baudel, basically, where whoever and whatever does not belong to the milieu and its three temporalities, it is relegated to. In order to make it a bit more concrete, Baudel built the épique durée using place-based narratives quoted in his work. He relies a lot on the works of Cervantes, Bandello, Boccaccio, and Alemann's text to differentiate a variety of uses of time that set specific parameters between power and inequality across the sea. So I extracted one of these many quotes where these disturbing views are obvious. and I will read it to you. Once upon a time, yes, during the heroic times of the voyages of the Phoenicians or the Greek, colonization has been a tragedy, but not later. From then, colonizing is all about having the same trees, plants, landscapes before us, as well as the same food on your table. It is about living under the same skies. End of quote. So, is Brodel any original in relegating colonial Mediterranean to the epic durée, to heroic time? Well, I will argue that he is building on a long tradition of works that since the late Middle Ages were bolstering unitary vision of the Mediterranean. Among many of them, I would like to use a text published in Rome in 1646 by a Jesuit, his name is Giovanni Battista Ferrari, who decided to write a mytho-history, also a natural history of citrus fruits, the first of its kind because it was only dedicated to one genus of fruit, in order to explain how the legendary gardens of the Hesperides moved from West Africa to Italy. And here you have some of the engravings that Ferrari published in order to represent this trip across the Mediterranean, when and where sovereignty coming from Africa were displaced and relocated in the Italian peninsula. So how does this image that we have in front of us today connect with Brodel? Well, there are several ways to think about this connection in a productive way. First, Brodel ends the first part of the Mediterranean with a very powerful images of small boats, fast fleets that are invading the sea. And these small boats, fast fleets, are in fact embodying really the world, a new world of movement that is going to be the main topic of the second part of Brodel's work. I will argue that these boats are somehow reminiscent of Renaissance and Baroque images that depict landscape and the presence of these small boats in the background of the images. And these images are representing the sea as a hub for mainly agricultural transplantation and land dislocation. Second, Ferrari, just like Brodel, emphasized a Mediterranean made of coastline, a Mediterranean made of cities, of urbanitas. And these images are very powerful because they are standing in opposition with what Brodel called the grandissimi deserts that divided the Mediterranean country, and that we heard a lot about yesterday, thanks to Toby. However, the coastline of the Mediterranean are the privileged spaces of urban sites where travelers rest for a while in the comfort of the fonduks. So here we are engaging with a very thin layered vision of the Mediterranean, which opposes a thick understanding of the sea and its many territories. In addition to that, both Ferrari and Brodel share a common vision of empty spaces of labor. In fact, in their works, they limit their references to labor exclusively to transactional labor. And by doing so, they are basically delinking the production of capital from the production of nature, rendering nature exogenous. And this is not coming from me, this is coming from historian Jason Moore. But what's the effect of all of that? Is the creation of a poetic, in both Brodel and Ferrari, of inhuman spaces where resistance and as well cooperation are rendered impossible in their own terms. Maybe Brodel will conceive that resistance can happen within specific spaces that are all contained spaces, especially islands. He loves to speak about exploitation, but only in islands in particular. So there is one use of the term ecology in Brodel in the first part of the Mediterranean, of the term ecology. And this term is used to draw a line between environments where dromedaries and camel lives. So it's basically the creation of a line that I would call the Middle East, dividing the Far and the Near East. That separates the people of the sea again from the Tuareg de l'air and the people of the high country. Mountain and deserts form inhuman spaces. And I will add that isthmus that are often channeling the world of movement are also contributing to these inhuman spaces. And what's the problem here? The problem is that there is an anxiety in early modern, late medieval thinkers and modern thinkers about seeing the temporality of these inhuman spaces erupting in the very beautiful, entangled, dynamic temporalities that we as historians also love to play with when we deal with scale and dynamism for history, the long, the moyen, and court durée. So my question, another one, what would a history of the Mediterranean look like from these inhuman spaces? Well, I believe that this is an opportunity to adopt a new focus on the term cooperation. Whoever has been traveling through the Mediterranean, cooperation, it's a key word, not only in the sense of people collaborating, but cooperation as an institutional organization that allow heterogeneous actors to communicate among each other. And we can think of this cooperation beyond the ecological lines and across globally entangled settler colonialism, that we are not restricted to communication among the people of the sea. And here I'm building on the new book by Miriam Alley Davis who studies this question in relation with the history of 19th and 20th century French Algeria. So let's focus on the case study. How can we merge together the microecologies and the micro-narratives in Brodel in order to think about different actors beyond the people of the sea? When dealing with the War of Granada, a famous episode of Mediterranean history at the end of the 16th century that happened between 1568 and 1570s, Brodel is telling us that the revolt happened only because of people located in the mountain, the Alpujarras, started to raid the plain of Andalusia, quoting and saying that the indigenous city, Granada, and the Morisco living in it, who had been converted to Catholicism or were descendants of former converts, did not rise. Okay, the cities are the movers of the Mediterranean, so they should be preserved for any forms of revolt. However, if we go back to other canonical, I would say, narrative about this episode from the early modern period, and we look at the text by Hurtado de Mendoza's Chronicle of the War of Granada, there is an opportunity here to extract some micro-narratives within this text that are about cooperation between Morisco communities. And these micro-narratives in Hurtado de Mendoza give us a very interesting and insightful opportunity to observe, for example, how spaces of movement, gardens, were supposed to contain this movement, were in fact being used in a very different way during the revolt. They were used as improvised spaces of political communication among the rebels, okay? So the historian, when reading that, think about, okay, what kind of anxiety this generated? So let's go back to the archives. And when one goes back to the Archivo General de Simancas, and especially look at the section Casas y Sitios Reales, we see that there was a lot of archival fever, as Derrida would say, that was produced in relation with the use of these gardens, the subversive use of these gardens during the period. Philip II, the king at the time, named, for example, one of his Arabic translators as alcaide of the garden of the Alhambra to prevent any kind of connection being made between the so-called rebel and pre-1492 Islamic memories. Here, we go back to the Mediterranean. Brodel does not use Hurtado. He quotes Hurtado, but never in relation with the War of Granada. When he mentioned Hurtado, this is connected with other consideration. And this is very interesting because Hurtado de Mendoza is very much part of the literary world that Brodel was relying on, Cervantes, El Lazarillo. His name has often been used to maybe say that Hurtado was the possible author of the Lazarillo, which is probably not the case, but Hurtado was a famous Mediterranean diplomat. So it's very surprising, this kind of reading that Brodel is doing. But this reading allows Brodel to present the revolt, and I quote, as the result of violent people, made of lost movement in a wild space. Basically, he presented it as an attempt of the high country to colonize Granada. So here, Brodel is for us inverting the terms of Mediterranean colonization, I believe. So how can we relied on this cooperation, but we can see in the same literary sources that Baudel was using in order to think another way. So in conclusion, even if ecology tends to separate, at least in Baudel, in Ferrari, and many more, a world of movement from the one of the epic durée, I believe that Mediterranean microecologies and micronarratives, such as the one I presented about Hurtado de Mendoza, speak about the interpersonal, agricultural, and pastoralist history of cooperation across the sea. And I believe that these elements are as fundamental as hegemonic, transactional vision of the sea for the understanding of the early global ages. Thank you very much.